Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to say a few words of thanks. Sincere thanks to Marilyn Morgan for making the arrangements for this evening. And thank you, the members of the Buckingham Historic Churches Trust, for signing up to this event and to supporting this admirable charity. A special thanks, of course, to John Adams and Thomas Jefferson for visiting our county and thereby giving me an interesting topic to talk about this evening. Adams and Jefferson travelled together in 1786 and spent the best part of a hectic week principally to see the country houses, gardens and parks in Middle England. I'm afraid the churches did not feature much in their sightseeing, so I apologise now if churches get short shrift in this talk. The principal highlights of their tour were the landscape gardens at Stowe, Shakespeare's birthplace, Stratford-on-Avon, Birmingham, and of Blenheim Palace. However, I ought to point out that when they visited in 1786, neither of them could have supposed that each might one day be elected President of the United States. The reason for this is that the office did not then exist. The proposal for a president with executive power, elected by an electoral college, exactly as it is today, was not put forward and agreed upon until the autumn of 1787. In due course, as we know, George Washington was elected as the first president and took office in April 1789. My talk will last for about 45 minutes, and I have 5 main points of focus. First, a quick look at Adams and Jefferson as a reminder of their lives and achievements, and to offer a summary of their relationship, which swung like a pendulum between cordial familiarity and bitter enmity. Then a look at the journey and the places they visited. I will also comment on the challenges and expenses of travel in the 18th century. Next, a look at Buckingham in 1786, where Jefferson and Adams stayed overnight, for the town was the most convenient stopover for the all-important visit to Stowe. I will also attempt a summary of the consequences of their visit, which in Jefferson's case was considerable. Finally, I would like to show you an extract from Kenneth Clark's Civilization, in which he talks about Jefferson and gives a fascinating insight into the house that he built for himself at Monticello, Virginia. First, then, a snapshot of Adams and Jefferson.
Adams was the second President of the United States from 1797 to 1801. His was not an easy presidency, and perhaps more significantly I should emphasize that it was he that negotiated the Treaty of Paris that brought an end to the Revolutionary War and established some sort of harmony between Great Britain and the United States. Following this success, he was appointed the first US Minister to Great Britain in 1785. In 1788 he returned home, having spent 10 years in Europe at the prime of his life in his 40s and 50s. He was aged 51 when he made his tour with Jefferson. Jefferson followed Adams as the third President of the United States and was elected for 2 terms, 1801 to 05 and 1805 to 09. He spent 4 years in Europe from 1785 to 1789 in Paris as America's Minister Plenipotentiary. He returned home in September 1789, having witnessed the storming of the Bastille and the early days of the French Revolution. He was aged 43 when he made his journey with Adams. In one of his novels, William Boyd makes his characters play a game where they have to summarize the personality and character of somebody that they each know in 4 adjectives. It is a rather good game in any circumstances. So, playing it, how might one summarize Adams and Jefferson in 4 adjectives? I confess I did not find it especially easy, but here is my attempt. John Adams in 4 adjectives. Puritanical, urban, inflexible, ambitious. Thomas Jefferson in 4 adjectives. Enigmatic, patrician, creative, country-loving. Both men were happily married, but the courses of their married lives were rather different. Adams married his 3rd cousin Abigail, 9 years his junior, who was also from Massachusetts, on October the 25th, 1764. She was 20 years old, he was 29. They were happily married for 54 years. She was resourceful and radical, and in fact much admired by Jefferson. She was a supportive and loving wife who was often left alone because of her husband's political duties. She accompanied her husband during his decade in Europe, and as well as being a happy marriage, it was a fruitful one. 6 children, 3 boys, 3 girls, all of whom lived to adulthood, a rare achievement in the 18th century. Their eldest son became the 6th President of the United States. Jefferson's marriage, although happy, was not blessed with such longevity or fruition. Like Adams, he also married his 3rd cousin. Martha, like Jefferson, was from Virginia landed gentry, and when he fell in love with her, she was a young, wealthy widow. They were married on January the 1st, 1772. Jefferson was aged 29, Martha 24. She was vivacious, petite, accomplished, but sadly sickly. She bore 6 children, but only 2 daughters survived to adulthood. She was a loving and much loved wife who, when she died, requested that her husband should not remarry, a promise that he faithfully kept. Jefferson's own father had died when he was 14 years old. Perhaps, therefore, part of his self-contained elusiveness is that from an early age he had to make all decisions for himself and be entirely responsible for himself. When Martha's father died in 1773, the Jeffersons inherited his estate, which was considerable, but also together with its heavy debts. They also inherited his slaves, including Betty Hemings and her 10 mixed-race children. The youngest of them was Sally Hemings, about whom much has been written and speculated. She was, in point of fact, Martha's half-sister. So then, were Jefferson and Adams friends or enemies? Was their relationship chalk and cheese, or was it hand in glove? There scarcely could ever have been a friendship between greater opposites. Whereas Jefferson was tall and angular, Adams was short and squat. Jefferson was charismatic, Adams, by his own admission, obnoxious. The one was shy and quiet with a faint and squeaky voice. The other was a chatterbox with a booming voice. Jefferson was the aesthete with a taste for fine food and wine, dress, and works of art. Adams was heartily indifferent to these things. Jefferson was aloof and courteous. Adams was confrontational and ill-mannered. They must have appeared as an odd couple of travelling companions whilst on their journey through Middle England. As you will see from the map, they started in central London and went west to Twickenham and Reading, then out to Caversham and Wallingford, to Thame, to Buckingham, where they spent the night of the 6th of April, 1786, then to Stowe, to Stratford-upon-Avon, Birmingham, Stourbridge, Hagley Hall, Worcester, Blenheim Palace, and Oxford, High Wycombe, Uxbridge, and thence back to central London. Their journey covered 350 to 400 miles, and it took them 6 days. Well, that would be good going even by modern standards. I know that we tend to average 30 miles an hour when touring by car. A postchaise, I think, would be unlikely to average more than 10 or 15 miles an hour. Let me take you through the journey in a bit more detail. They start on Sunday, April the 2nd, and into Monday, April the 3rd from London, where they visit Hampton Court, Chiswick House, Pope's Villa at Twickenham, Esher Place, Claremont, and Paynes Hill. I think it is unlikely that they went into these houses, which were then, of course, all in private ownership. At best, they would have seen them from the outside and perhaps walked around the grounds. It is on Tuesday, April the 4th, that they begin their journey into Middle England in earnest, travelling from London to Twickenham, to Caversham and on to Reading, where they spend the night, a distance of 40 miles. On Wednesday, April the 5th, they travel to Wallingford, to Thame, to Wootton, which, like Stowe, was owned by the Marquis of Buckingham, and must have arrived late in the evening in Buckingham to stay at the Cobham Arms Inn. Thursday, April the 6th, is an important day. They visit Stowe, which I will look at in detail later, then the famous battlefield at Edge Hill, where in 1642, early in the English Civil War, the Royalist forces led by the King, Charles I, narrowly defeated the opposing parliamentary forces led by the Earl of Essex. From there they went to Banbury, and finally to Shakespeare's birthplace, Stratford-upon-Avon, where they stayed the night. They must have covered a good 45 miles, and indeed overall one is bound to wonder how much time can they have spent in each place that they visited. The next day, Friday, April the 7th, they journeyed from Stratford to Birmingham, Birmingham being the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, which was then in its healthy infancy. In Birmingham they visited wallpaper and papier-mâché factories, and from there they went to visit Leaso's, one of the most important and influential natural landscape gardens of the 18th century, designed by the poet William Shenstone. On Saturday, April the 8th, they travelled to another pioneering landscape garden with poetic connections, Hagley Park. From there they went to the important town of Worcester, famous for its handsome cathedral and new porcelain factory, and they would also have seen the recently constructed, splendid five-arch stone bridge. From there they went to Woodstock, just outside Oxford, staying at the famous and still flourishing Bear Inn. They must have been exhausted after a journey of 80 miles. Undaunted, on Sunday, April the 9th, they visited the Duke of Marlborough's Blenheim Palace, the University City of Oxford, then on to High Wycombe and Uxbridge, just outside London, where they spent the final night of their journey. At the time, Adams was resident in London permanently as the United States Minister to England. He lived in Grosvenor Square, where until recently the American Embassy used to be. Jefferson, on the other hand, was resident in Paris, and his visit to London between March the 12th and April the 10th must have been a welcome escape from his duties as Minister Plenipotentiary. Jefferson stayed in Golden Square near Piccadilly, and if you think their journey through some half a dozen counties of Middle England was hectic and demanding enough, during their stay in London they managed to pack in visits to the Opera, to hear one of Salieri's operas, Windsor Castle, Enfield Chase, Moor Park, Osterley, Zion House, the British Museum, Kew Gardens, Covent Garden, Ranelagh Gardens, the Greenwich Observatory, the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, as well as attending the French ambassador's ball. They were also presented to King George III and Queen Charlotte, but I am sorry to say that this occasion is recorded as being particularly frosty and unsatisfactory to all parties concerned. Next, let's have a look at what Buckingham was like in 1786. The town centre had been devastated by a terrible fire in 1725, which had destroyed all the main buildings, including the church. Rebuilding had taken some time. Jefferson and Adams would, however, have certainly seen the new church, reconstructed on a completely new site on Castle Hill. It was started in 1777 and consecrated in 1781. Perhaps I should add that Jefferson would not recognise the church that we have today, as it was altered to its present Victorian Gothic appearance in 1862. The town hall was given a new facade in the 1780s, and this remains unaltered from Jefferson's time to now. He would also have seen the new jail, looking like a miniature fortress that had been paid for by the Temple Grenville family in 1748. Buckingham in 1786 was a medium-sized market town, but significant, for this was the moment when the coaching trade was at its peak. Buckingham was at the heart of the turnpike system, the toll roads which, by the end of the 18th century, linked all the English counties together, and the meeting point for 5 major roads, radiating out to London and the southeast, Banbury and the Midlands, Oxford and the southwest, Cambridge in the east, and Northampton and the north. As a consequence, the town boasted many coaching inns for travellers, including the Cobham Arms. Buckingham may also have looked more familiar to Adams and Jefferson than many other towns that they stayed in. The reason for this is that because of the fire of 1725, all of central Buckingham was newly built, so in many ways its appearance was probably not unlike similar towns in America, whose architecture and design ancestry was British, and which had few buildings dating back more than 50 years or so. I think it is also worth pointing out that Jefferson had been born and brought up next door to Buckingham County, Virginia, the only one of such names in the whole of the USA. Formed from Albemarle County, it is uncertain why it was given the name Buckingham, but is it perhaps possible that Jefferson was curious to see the original and historic Buckingham? As is well known, Jefferson was an obsessive and compulsive note-taker, and his books of memoranda included not just his observations and philosophical thoughts. Running into 41 volumes, they also contain meticulous accounts of money spent day by day. They give an interesting insight into the realities and expenses of tourism and travel in the 18th century, and one can observe how it compares with such realities today. It is possible to calculate the comparison if you look at the right-hand column of this slide. The jottings on the left are all from Jefferson's memorandum book, and the numbers 6, 6, 7 and 8 in the left-hand side refer to those days in April 1786. I have emphasised a number of features in bold, so that from the top you can see that horses to Wallingford were 23 shillings, turnpike tolls were 7 and 6, the equivalent of £50, horses to Thame were 22 and 7, £130, postilions cost him 55 shillings, £300. If at first sight horses and postilions seem expensive, perhaps it is worth pointing out that today, to hire a chauffeur-driven limousine of first-class quality, to be entirely at the hirer's command, might well cost £400 to £500 a day. It is not clear if the reference to Buckingham Guide 7 and 6, that is £50, is a reference to a book or to someone to show them the delights of Buckingham Town. The following day, April the 6th, he buys books in Buckingham costing 9 shillings, that is over £50, so books in 1786 were therefore very expensive. On the other hand, Seeing House where Shakespeare was born cost 1 shilling, the equivalent of £5, and that is about the same as it is today. I think there is no doubt that 18th century travel was expensive. Even public stagecoaches were beyond the pocket of the ordinary working man. It was the later coming of the railways that eventually made travel affordable to the populace as a whole. Indeed, even in my early memory, the most expensive part of travelling was getting there. Once there, it was relatively cheap. Today, it is, of course, quite the reverse. Getting there can be ridiculously cheap, and the shock is how expensive it is having got there. Travel is also much more comfortable today, though perhaps not so sociable. By any yardstick, however, I think that what Adams and Jefferson managed to pack into their 6 days is extraordinary, and even if it was worth it, the cost must have been prodigious. I would now like to talk about the making of Stowe. In its heyday, Stowe was a centre of political power, and it has been well said that 18th century Britain was governed from Stowe. It was in these gardens that plans for a future British Empire were often discussed. The ambition was to extend Britain's colonial empire, and the American colonies were one of the principal jewels in this crown. The house and its celebrated gardens were the creation of several generations of the Temple Grenville family, and Stowe is now most remembered in retrospect as the birthplace of the English landscape garden. By the time of their visit in 1786, the house and gardens had been remodelled by Richard II Earl Temple, and so gained the appearance that we know today. Richard Temple had inherited Stowe in 1749 on the death of his uncle Lord Cobham, who had no children. Richard Temple, in turn, died in 1779, 30 years later, from a fractured skull caused by a fall from his carriage whilst driving on the estate. He also, having no children, bequeathed Stowe to his nephew George, who became the first Marquis of Buckingham. This nephew's father, George Grenville, was actually the Prime Minister associated with the American Stamp Act of 1765, a well-intentioned measure which was to have such unforeseen circumstances. Even in 1786, Stowe Gardens were the most famous in Europe. They were much copied from Paris to St. Petersburg and much talked about. As Minister Plenipotentiary in Paris, Jefferson would have got wind of all of this. Interestingly, the gardens at Stowe were always open to the general public. It was one of the first showplaces in England to introduce formal arrangements for tourists, with set opening times and specially printed guidebooks, and with the provision of accommodation such as the Cobham Arms Inn. Some idea of the extent of the transformation achieved by Richard Temple can be gained by comparing Benton Seeley's new edition of his guidebook of 1777 with his edition of some 25 years earlier. Jefferson made copious notes of A Tour of English Gardens, and here you can see him writing that, quote, "I always walked over the gardens with Thomas Whately's The Garden Landscape Guide in my hand, and examined with particular attention those particular spots that he described." He goes on, "My inquiries were directed chiefly to such practical things that might enable me to estimate the expense of making and maintaining a garden in that style." I think there is no doubt that the itinerary they followed was principally of Jefferson's choosing, with an eye to what he might achieve in future at Monticello. Adams was not particularly interested in gardens or architecture. I think more to his interest would have been the battlefield at Edge Hill, and perhaps the custom of other visitors to Stratford-upon-Avon of cutting a souvenir piece of wood from a chair where Shakespeare had supposedly sat. At Stowe, Jefferson noted the number of men and boys necessary to maintain the pleasure grounds. He was particularly thrilled by the ha-ha, which, although French in invention, had recently been introduced in Stowe. On the other hand, he was less impressed by the prominent Corinthian arch, which formally and grandly announces the entrance to Stowe, considering it to have been, quote, very useless in appearance, inasmuch it had no pretension to any destination. Instead of being an object from the house, it is an obstacle to a very pleasing distant prospect. What then were the repercussions of the visit? The expedition, and the visit to Stowe in particular, had considerable influence on Jefferson. On his return, he remodelled parts of Monticello and introduced new features into his gardens. Monticello was, of course, entirely Jefferson's own personal creation, and it was there that his own pursuit of happiness reached its fullest expression. Monticello was created on a much smaller scale and more domestic than Stowe, but the house is recognisably in the same neoclassical style, and both Stowe and Monticello were under active construction in the 1770s. Indeed, I would like to think that there was a moment, sometime on the same day, somewhere in the 1770s, when Jefferson sat in his study at Monticello, contemplating first what to do next with his house and garden, and then later what to do about the tyrannical government in England, just as simultaneously at Stowe the Temple Grenville family were also in conversation, contemplating what to do next with their house and garden, and also what to do about the troublesome colonists in America. Stowe caused Jefferson to expand his vision for Monticello and to incorporate features that he had seen in the gardens there, including his own vision of the ha-ha and a garden pavilion that he and visitors could retreat to in the same manner and for the same purpose as the temples and pavilions at Stowe. The other repercussions, and particularly the impact on their friendship, which seems to have been so intimate during the tour, were not the consequence of the visit, but of later politics. By the time of their return to America, the armed struggle against Britain was over, the constitutional final settled, and George Washington was soon to be elected president. Both Jefferson and Adams were part of Washington's first government. Adams was vice president, Jefferson Secretary of State. Now the two friends who had seemed so happy together in Buckingham became bitter political opponents. It was one thing to be united about the Declaration of Independence and the desire to create a new United States of America. It was, however, an entirely different matter deciding the future course of those United States. In cabinet they were like two fighting cocks, constantly scrapping. Washington was driven to despair by their incessant fighting. Adams argued for a strong, centralized executive, with power being held by an urban elite and prosperity stemming from industrialization. His foreign policy was pro-British. Jefferson thought that Adams wished to turn the presidency into a new version of monarchy and opposed all moves in that direction. Jefferson, on the other hand, argued for minimal government interference, with power held by the individual states and landowners, prosperity stemming from agricultural production. His foreign policy was pro-French. Adams thought Jefferson was a loose cannon whose ambition was permanent revolution, and he tried to block Jefferson whenever he could. There was no way of reconciling the former friends, and both were determined to fight each other to the political death, especially when Jefferson became Adams's vice president and resorted to every means to thwart Adams's political aims. Fortunately, my story does have a happy ending. When both men had finished with high office, they were eventually able to recover the friendship which had once been so cordial. In 1812 they started writing letters to each other. Adams lived in Massachusetts, Jefferson in Virginia. It was not possible to meet personally, but the correspondence between them, which they maintained for over a decade, until their final days, is one of the gems of American literature. Symbolically, both men died on July the 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Yet, competitive to the end, each was determined to outlive the other, and it was Adams who, unknowingly, achieved that ambition. He died at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, unaware that Jefferson had died only a few hours earlier, at about midday.
Well, that ends my account of John Adams's and Thomas Jefferson's visit to Middle England. There is not a lot else I can add, although I am aware that I have put neither of them and their achievements into the wider context against which they deserve to be seen. To compensate for this omission, I thought it might be interesting to show you an extract from Kenneth Clarke's pioneering 13-part series, Civilization. Civilization was made 50 years ago, and many of us who write and talk about the arts remain constantly indebted to it. It was a self-admittedly and unashamedly personal view of European civilization, in particular the way that all the arts, painting, sculpture and architecture, music, literature and poetry, are interlinked to create a tapestry of ideas and influences. Clarke's patrician style and point of view is now completely out of fashion, but the series is still worth watching because of the depth of his knowledge and the remarkable prescience of his sense of what the future might hold. By and large, he was not enamoured by the American interpretation of European civilization, although he had to accept that it was now dominant. Basically, he found it a too shallow and too material an interpretation, and although he tried to be optimistic about what they might do with it, he was, quote, not exactly joyful about the prospect before us. There was, however, one American whom he clearly admired, and in whom I sense found a kindred spirit. That was Thomas Jefferson. John Adams doesn't even get a mention. He spoke at length about Jefferson in episode 10 of Civilization, which was filmed in Virginia and in particular at Monticello.
Here is my edited extract of that episode of Civilization.
The remarkable thing about the frivolous 18th century was its seriousness. It was, in many ways, the heir to Renaissance humanism. But there was a vital difference. The Renaissance had taken place within the framework of the Christian Church. A few humanists had showed signs of skepticism, but no one had expressed doubts about the Christian religion as a whole. People had the comfortable moral freedom that goes with an unquestioned faith. But by the middle of the 18th century, serious-minded men could see that the church had become a tied house, tied to property and status, and defending its interests by repressions and injustice. However, several of the contributors to the encyclopedia were total materialists. And so the late 18th century was faced with the troublesome task of constructing a new morality without revelation or Christian sanctions. This morality was built on two foundations. One of them was the doctrine of natural law, the other, the Stoic morality of ancient Republican Rome. In fact, the new morality had already guided a revolution outside Europe. Once more, we must leave the ancient focus of civilization and travel to the edge of the civilized world, America. For it was in this virgin soil and not in the compost heap of Europe, that the aims of the encyclopedia were first realized. In the 18th century, no white man, except hunters, had penetrated beyond that range of hills. But here, on the border territory of the Indian, the trapper, the buffalo, a young Virginian lawyer elected to build his home in the 1760s. His name was Thomas Jefferson, and he called his house Monticello, the Little Mountain. It must have been an extraordinary apparition in that wild landscape. Jefferson made it up out of the book of the great Renaissance architect Palladio, of which he is said to have owned the only copy in America. But of course, he had to invent a great deal of it himself, and he was highly inventive. The interior of the house betrays the obstinate ingenuity of a creative man who is determined to work out everything for himself. This is his idea for a bed placed between two rooms in the wall, so he could get out either side, either into his study or his sitting room. And to dress, he went up this little circular stair to the room above. And this was his own design for spectacles in a little box the size of a patch box. They look a little small, but in fact you can read by them perfectly well, and with them I can read his own edition of Vitruvius, the classical architect who inspired so much of his building. It's placed on a table, a revolving table, which he designed himself, which works very well, and a revolving chair. Everything in the room he designed, the drapes, the moldings, every single thing. And it all has a kind of simple, homespun, independent air, which is the stamp of Jefferson. He was the typical universal man of the 18th century. Linguist, scientist, agriculturalist, educator, town planner, and architect. Almost every incarnation of Leon Battista Alberti, the universal man of the Renaissance. Even down to a love of music and the management of horses and a certain crankiness. What in a lesser man could have been called a touch of self-righteousness. What a willful, independent head. Of course, Jefferson wasn't as good an architect as Alberti, but then he was also President of the United States. And as an architect, he was by no means bad. Monticello was the beginning of that simple, almost rustic classicism that stretches right up the eastern seaboard of America, right up to Massachusetts, and lasted for 100 years, producing a body of simple, civilized, domestic architecture equal to any in the world. And it reflects the grave self-assurance of the founders of the American Republic. Jefferson is buried in the grounds of Monticello. He left instructions for his tomb. On it were to be inscribed the following sentences, and not a word more. Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. Well, the establishment of religious freedom that earned him so much hatred and abuse in his own day, we now take for granted. But the University of Virginia is still a surprise. It was all designed by Jefferson, and it's full of his character. He called it an academical village. There are 10 pavilions for 10 professors, and between them, behind this colonnade, the rooms of the students, all within reach and yet all individual. The ideal of corporate humanism. And then outside the courtyard are small gardens that show his love of privacy. Those serpentine walls were Jefferson's speciality. Nobody knows where he got them from. Needless to say, they had a practical as well as an aesthetic intention. The great courtyard was round 3 sides of a rectangle. The fourth side you saw over the mountains to Indian territory. How confidently in their semi-wild domain the founding fathers of America assumed the mantle of republican virtue and put into practice the notions of the French Enlightenment. They even called on the great sculptor of the Enlightenment, Houdon, to commemorate their victorious General Washington. And here's the result, standing in the Capitol at Richmond, Virginia. This program began with Houdon's statue of Voltaire, smiling the smile of reason. It could end with Houdon's statue of Washington. No more smiles. Houdon saw his subject as that favorite Roman Republican hero, the decent country gentleman called away from his farm to defend his neighbor's liberties. His monument dominates the new capital city, which was named after him. Facing it, across the tidal basin of the Potomac, is the monument to Jefferson, who became the third president. Not only the Palladian architecture, but the music has crossed the Atlantic. God Save the King has become My Country 'Tis of Thee. On the inner walls are quotations from Jefferson's writings. First, the familiar, noble, indestructible words of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Self-evident truths. That's the voice of 18th century Enlightenment. But on the opposite wall are less familiar words by Jefferson that still give us pause today. I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. Commerce between master and slave is despotism. Nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people are to be free. A peaceful-looking scene, a great ideal made visible, but beyond it, what problems? Almost insoluble, or at least not soluble by the smile of reason.